Helen Zia graduated in Princeton's first class of women, breaking a 200-year tradition. Her parents were elated when she was accepted to medical school, aghast when she dropped out.
My father would write me letters that were so angry, and I'd pick them up, I'd open them, and I'd peek just to see the beginning of what he might have written. And some of them began with the salutation, "To my daughter, who is worse than my worst enemy." And then they would just go downhill from there.
She didn't help matters by moving to Detroit to stamp out car hoods and fenders on an assembly line. But what happened in Detroit would change Helen's life and touch the lives of Asian Americans all across the country. In 1982, Detroit was a grim place.
At the start of the new year, the U.S. Labor Department said Michigan's jobless rate was 14.9%, nearly double the national average. Time passed.
Its cars couldn't compete with those coming from Japan, and the resentment of all things Japanese was palpable. On June 19, 1982, Vincent Chin, a draftsman, was days away from his wedding, celebrating his bachelor party at a neighborhood lounge.
Unfortunately for him, sitting across from him at the bar were two auto workers who looked at him, saw his Asian face, his Chinese face, and saw red. They saw him as the enemy.
We'll never know for sure how it started. There was drinking, and angry words were exchanged. The white men mistook Chen for Japanese and taunted him. He was a nip, a Jap, then a chink. It's because of you, they said, that we're out of work. After a scuffle broke out, everyone was told to leave. Once outside, the white stalked Chen, cornered him, then beat him with a baseball bat. 4 days later, he was dead.
I remember that distinctly because I was at a gallery showing in Chinatown. Somebody walked in and said, "Have you heard?" "Heard what?" "They killed a Chinese guy in Detroit because they thought he was Japanese." And everybody got quiet because this was our worst fear.
It wasn't in the Deep South. It wasn't in 19th century California. It was in Detroit. If it could happen to Vincent Chin, it could happen to any Chinese American.
Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz were charged with second-degree murder, but plea bargained down to lesser charges of manslaughter. Their sentence, $3,000 fines plus court fees and probation. The judge was quoted as saying, "These weren't the kind of people you send to jail." Helen had been laid off her job as an auto worker. She was writing for a couple of Detroit papers when she heard the news.
It was like wildfire. You know, the first meeting had 100 people. The next meeting had 200 people.
The light sentences outraged much of Detroit and stunned the Asian community. But lawyers said there was little hope of changing them.
Vincent Chin's mother was crying because it sounded like people were saying there's nothing we can do. And I sat there and I raised my hand. And I said, we have to let people know that we think this is wrong. We have to do something. Speaking up about this had everything to do with my experiences and the cumulative insults. All of the things that had built up, all of the things I had seen my parents subjected to, all of the bitterness that I could see my father carried with him because he was making baby novelties. All of those things came to me. In these meetings, there would be people who would stand up and say, "I've been working as a scientist or an engineer for the last 30 years in this company. I've taught every wet, behind-the-ears college kid to be my boss, and I know I've known more than every one of them has ever known, and I've never been considered to be the supervisor. This time, I have to speak up.
We want justice! We want justice! We want justice!
With Chinese leading the way, a coalition formed with Japanese, Filipinos, Koreans, and South Asians. It was the first Asian American advocacy group of its kind with a national scope, and it led to one of the first federal prosecutions of a civil rights case on behalf of an Asian American.
To have rallies and demonstrations and to be marching and talking about civil rights and about racism was something very new to Chinese Americans and to Asian Americans. For community people, for restaurant workers to shut down their restaurants for a day so that their waiters and their cooks and the family could go and participate in a march, that was unheard of. And that was how deeply people felt at that moment, how important it was, 100 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act, to say, 100 years have gone by. We don't have to accept this stuff anymore.
When the federal conviction was thrown out on appeal, Lily Chen filed a civil suit and won. The men were ordered to pay her compensation, but most of it she never saw. They never served time in jail.